So today we have with us Professor Aakash Singh Rathore. Great to have you with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Your book's being released today. I think it's your 10th book, right?
Ninth book.
Ninth.
Yeah. 10th is coming. Volume 2 will be the 10th.
Right. When can we expect that?
I think it depends how much blowback I get from Volume 1. So if it's well received, then Volume 2 should be ready by December. If people raise, issues of various kinds, then I might have to reflect a bit more and push off by next Ambedkar Jayanti for sure.
Right. So I have the book here. I'll just wrap it.
Oh, that's wonderful.
The title is it's the first in a two-part biography of Dr. Ambedkar. The title is Becoming Babasaheb, Life and Times of Bhimrao, Ramji, Ambedkar.
Looks nice. On the cover, you see a rare photograph. I'm not sure the public has ever seen it. It's a photo from his 1932 passport, the original passport I was able to find in the India Office archives in London.
Right. That's one that shows his birth date is 1892, right?
Exactly.
Awesome. So shall we begin?
Yes, please.
A few questions. So so it's a biography of Dr. Ambedkar that puts the man himself, his life experiences, his character front and center. So what motivated you, a philosopher, to write this way, rather than say a purely intellectual biography? What was the genesis of the idea?
Well, the genesis of writing a biography arose around 2010, when I was working on the critical edition of the Buddha and his Dhamma. So this was one of Dr. Ambedkar's greatest achievements, this book, which he referred to as a sort of Buddhist Bible, where he was putting together in one book innumerable different traditions of Buddhist thought and reflection into one that he thought would serve for all of the Navayana Buddhists, all the new Buddhists. In that, he wrote an autobiographical preface, but that autobiographical preface was suppressed. It hadn't been published in any of the editions of the Buddha and his Dhamma that were released. So when I was doing the critical edition, which means the annotated edition where I gave all of Dr. Ambedkar's sources for his Navayana Buddhism, I also included his autobiographical preface about why he was writing this so-called Buddhist Bible. And I realized that there was an untapped connection between Babasaheb's personal motivations, his life challenges and life decisions, and his objective intellectual and political achievements. So at that time, I decided to learn more about his personal life and read, of course, all of the existing biographies. What I found in all of the existing biographies, without exception, was that there was very little about the man himself, his interior life. There were intellectual biographies, for sure. There were sort of writings of how he emerged as a political phenomenon. There were various approaches that were taken, but all of these approaches were what I call bloodless. So they didn't represent him in flesh and blood. And you asked, as a philosopher, why did I write? So as a philosopher, we think about this concept referred to as lived experience as a kind of condition for one's understanding of social realities, or one's limitations in how one can understand the social realities of another. And philosophers focus on lived experience. Intellectual biographies, the ones about Ambedkar especially, they seem to neglect this aspect of lived experience or present it in a very superficial way. So both as an Ambedkar scholar interested in his life and work, his achievements, and as a philosopher interested in the interiority, what motivates a person to do what he or she does. These came together for me to focus on not on an intellectual biography, but on a narrative that's fundamentally personality driven.
Okay. I think another motivation might have been that you seem to have found quite a lot of mistakes in the early biographies, right? In terms of the dates and locations. And so how did all these errors come about? And how did you go about ascertaining the correct facts?
Well, that's a very long story. I don't know if you had a look at any of the footnotes, but in one of the footnotes, I give kind of a long confession that I myself, in earlier books, you had mentioned the earlier books I've written, I myself, in earlier books, I have recently discovered, made the same sorts of errors that almost every biographer or Ambedkar scholar has made. Now, how these errors came about, there are kind of two original sets of mistakes. And these two original sets go back to the two classic biographies, one in English by Dhananjay Keer, written in the 1950s, and in a way looked at by Dr. Ambedkar himself, and another in Marathi by Kharmode, which was published beginning in the 60s. Eventually, there were 12 volumes published. And Kharmode was the man who gave Dr. Ambedkar that title of Babasaheb. He worked closely with Dr. Ambedkar. Because both Keer and Kharmode had these personal interactions with Dr. Ambedkar, all subsequent biographers and those interested in Dr. Ambedkar assumed in good faith that these books were well-researched, fact-checked, and accurate. But for various reasons, in the case of Kharmode, just simple limitations. He wasn't able to go to places like New York and London and archives that I have the privilege to be able to visit. And in the case of Keer, a kind of, let's say, shoddy, I don't want to say conspiratorial, but there is a conspiratorial aspect in Keer's writing. He was very deeply motivated to bring Savarkar and Ambedkar together. So partly just shoddy fact-checking, partly conspiracy. Keer's biography was full of mistakes and errors. But as I had mentioned, I myself had fallen into this trap. So how did I get awoken from this? This is quite a funny story. Part of it derives from what we had just mentioned, that passport photo I found in the India office in London. When I saw 1892, I was quite perplexed. How can Dr. Ambedkar himself have written in his own hand that his birth year was 1892? This, of course, is never mentioned by Keer or Kharmode, that there are various rival dates to both his day of birth, not 14th April as we celebrate, and his year of birth. But Dr. Ambedkar's letters, his personal documents, to which I was fortunate to have access over the last 7 to 10 years, they show a very different story from what Keer and Kharmode have both kind of laid out as the authoritative dates of Dr. Ambedkar. So that opened a small wedge. And as I began to look at documents other than Keer and Kharmode, this phenomenon reappeared over and over again. Contemporary newspaper accounts of Ambedkar's life differed in dates and even events than those that appeared in Keer and Kharmode. My trip to Germany and to London uncovered different aspects about Dr. Ambedkar's time there. I learned that Dr. Ambedkar was in Germany at a time completely different from what Keer and Kharmode had written in their biographies. And just over and over, I would discover these small details. And then I decided that this is not just coincidence that it should happen 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And I set about at that point to write a biography that ignored the fact that Keer and Kharmode ever wrote their books at all. Of course, I've read their books many, many times, and I constantly refer to them to compare what is it that they say versus what is it that I have found. But essentially, discovering all of these small cracks in the edifice that those two classic biographies created forced me just all in all to abandon them and start over from the archives.
Dr. Ambedkar himself wasn't particularly helpful in this regard, right?
No. This is a funny thing. I don't know how sensitively people will take this. I've mentioned this to a couple of activist friends who frowned at me when I mentioned this, that both Kir and Karmode relied implicitly on what Dr. Ambedkar himself told them during interviews. And of course, why wouldn't you? You're a journalist, I'm an author. If you asked me a question, you would expect in good faith that I would give you the right answer, especially if it's about my own date of birth or when was I in New York last or something like this. The thing is that Dr. Ambedkar didn't seem to care at all about issues that we would refer to as kind of relevant to one's ego projection, one's self-representation, things like this. He was far more preoccupied with his political objectives, with his writings, with his research and study. And when he was asked questions about his experiences in Baroda, he would, of course, he would represent the interiority very well, what it is that he felt, what he suffered, what he achieved. But dates, he couldn't care less. In his own biography, in his own autobiography, which I find absolutely fascinating, his own autobiography, he misrepresents what years he was in New York, what years he was in Baroda, certain events like this. So biographers obviously have their work cut out for them when Dr. Ambedkar's own words are unreliable from the point of view of chronology. He just was not interested.
Going back to something you mentioned just now, Kir's motivation to connect Dr. Ambedkar and Savarkar. Can you elaborate a little on that? And what was the actual relationship?
So this is obviously going to be controversial, but I think we can't skirt around this anymore. 4 decades, almost 7 decades, Ambedkarites have had to look at an endorsement by Savarkar on the back cover of Kir's biography of Dr. Ambedkar. The first time I picked up this biography, I was a little surprised and bemused that Savarkar should write the endorsement on Ambedkar's biography. As you read Kir's biography, you find that on every occasion, whether merited or not, Kir brings Savarkar into Dr. Ambedkar's life. He does it when they may have actually met. I have discovered that he creates certain fictional encounters where they did not meet, but Kir had wanted them to meet. And he does it when, whenever the opportunity arises. In fact, Savarkar's name is mentioned more often in Ambedkar's biography than any other contemporary of Ambedkar, with the exception of Gandhi. But what did they really mean to one another? Now, what Kir had done by concocting this relationship and bringing Savarkar into Ambedkar's biography so significantly was that he misrepresented their relationship not only for Ambedkarites, but even for those who follow Savarkar. So there has been a trend in the, let's say, right orientation of the political spectrum to say that Ambedkar and Savarkar not only had a cordial personal relationship, but that their ideas even connected at times. Now, the latter relies primarily on the former. The idea that their ideas merge in some ways relies upon their supposed cordial relationship. But the fact is that this all comes down to one letter, a letter that had been missing for some time. I've included the letter in the appendix of my biography, which Dr. Ambedkar wrote to Savarkar in 1932, where, as any one of us would, it begins with very cordial salutations. You know, when you're writing a letter, even to someone you dislike, you don't start the letter by, you know, dear miserable enemy. You begin it by, dear sir, I hope you're well. These kinds of nice opening remarks. Keir, again, this is part of the conspiracy, reproduces only the opening remarks of this letter. He focuses on the first page, which has these cordial kind of salutations. He neglects the second page, which is where Dr. Ambedkar begins to really rip into Savarkar and his objectionable ideas objectionable to Dr. Ambedkar. We don't have the reply of Savarkar to Dr. Ambedkar, but I think it's significant that even Savarkar biographies rely on Keir for this exchange. And the idea basically gets built that since they had this cordial personal relationship where Dr. Ambedkar on the first page of the letter points out that Savarkar is indeed working to uplift the untouchables and work towards temple entry. The idea has been built upon this foundation, page 1 of the letter, that they were both working in a similar manner towards the alleviation of untouchability and temple entry for the untouchables. This couldn't be farther from the truth. As I mentioned in the biography, if you look at the second page of the letter, it's not that they had a similarity of ideas, it is that Dr. Ambedkar points out very radically how different their ideas are. So all of Ambedkar studies will slowly change as this truth is revered. And I think even the Savarkar biographies will have to change a little bit as this, the truth of their relationship becomes digested.
Now, let's talk a little bit about his time in America. I was thinking, what was his life outside campus like? And in particular, did he have any encounters with race in the American context?
So I don't know if you realize what a large can of worms your question is opening. Right now, as you know, there are these issues about casteism in the United States and new anti-discrimination laws that are being put on the table, for example, in California. And the activism of Dalits in America is emerging on a model and hand in hand with Black movement in America. And interestingly, the Black Dalit brotherhood, sisterhood alliance that is current in the United States harkens back to an assumed similar experience that Dr. Ambedkar had while living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in the 19-teens. Now, the problem is, and here's where I sort of bring rain on the celebration. The problem is at that time, the Upper West Side of New York was not Harlem as we know it today. It was not predominantly Black by any means. And the Harlem Renaissance, where Black consciousness really flourished, occurred about a decade after Ambedkar left New York and where he was. And consequently, this kind of very lovely notion that Dr. Ambedkar had experiences with racial awareness, the emergence of racial consciousness in Harlem while he was in New York, I believe is historically false. But that doesn't mean that he didn't learn about civic activism and the importance of civil rights while he was in New York. The thing is, it was not really race, it was about gender. So when Dr. Ambedkar was in Columbia University on the Upper West Side of New York, it wasn't emerging Black consciousness that was giving him ideas and inspiration about Dalit civil rights. It was the women's suffrage movement. And the women's suffrage movement was pioneered in New York City by colleagues fellow students and classmates of Dr. Ambedkar at Columbia University. In fact, this wonderful march that occurred, a women's march, where 50 women on horseback led thousands, 5 to 10,000 women marching up Fifth Avenue of New York City from that George Washington Monument all the way up Fifth Avenue. This was led by a woman who was in Dr. Ambedkar's class at Columbia. They graduated together. They had the same doctoral supervisors. And one can see in her writings that if you substitute the word untouchable for the word woman, there are, in Dr. Ambedkar's early writings, almost verbatim articulations about the Dalit movement and the need for Dalit emancipation to her arguments about women's suffrage and the need for women's emancipation. So while it's popular and it is even increasing, the idea is even increasing that Dr. Ambedkar in his time in New York was inspired by the emergence of Black consciousness. I don't think it's true, but he was certainly inspired by the women's suffrage movement in that period.
Thank you. Also, his experiences at university, I think you pointed to one of his writings where he, from his student days, where he talks in a rather nationalist vein about the glories of Indian civilization and such. So at what stage of his thought was this?
Well, interestingly, you can see within his master's thesis, so very young man, but also in his doctoral thesis in London, a little bit less so because in London was heavily surveilled. You know, the universities were infiltrated by spies keeping a watch on all of the Indian students in universities in England. But in that era, which is from 1913 to 1923 up to 25, he, like all of his intellectual and political compatriots, was very strongly nationalistic, oriented towards highlighting the greatness of Indian civilization. His orientation within that general attitude was to point out primarily Buddhist achievements as opposed to Hindu. But nevertheless, one can read passages in his master's thesis and his PhD thesis that are very, very similar to what any other nationalist of the time would have articulated. What's funny is that these have all been ignored, and they've been ignored partly because of the sort of mischaracterization by people like Arun Shourie of Ambedkar as against the national movement, but also not only by his antagonists, but even those of his champions who focus rather on what he had to say about their own cause, as opposed to what he had to say in terms of national pride in that period. So both sides of the political spectrum have not cared to see, you know, these very powerful and sometimes chauvinistic passages that appear in the young Ambedkar's writings.
So, going back to India, you mentioned that when the Vaikam Satyagraha was happening, Ambedkar wrote about its importance and how, and even expressed a cautious admiration for Mahatma Gandhi. So did he say anything further about Vaikam? And did it sort of influence his idea of Satyagraha later on?
Yeah, it certainly influenced his notions of Satyagraha that get carried into the Mahad struggle. It's very difficult to his explicit comments on Vaikom, or rather his public comments on Vaikom are rather limited. But what one can glean from his letters is that he was quite preoccupied with two things about it. One, what could it achieve? So just plainly objectively, what would it achieve? But two, and this is the interesting or more subtle aspect, what does it mean that its achievements would be predominantly the product of non-Dalit efforts? So not self-help by the community itself, but a kind of charitable assistance by the upper castes, and those on the side of Gandhi. So these two ideas stay with Ambedkar throughout his life. So it's not even the impact that the Vaikom Satyagraha had on the making of the Mahad Satyagraha, but also on the idea of help versus self-help. And that stays with him forever. In fact, it is in a way what distinctively characterizes his social movement for the rest of his life.
Staying with this theme of religion, you mentioned an amusing incident where these Mahar sadhus are gathered together and they get into a debate about Ambedkar is the avatar of exactly which god. Can you tell us a little about that and sort of the early stages of Ambedkar's deification?
Yeah, I identify this probably as the origin point of his deification. There must have been smaller private episodes, but still, it would have only been around this time, 1927, and not prior, because his achievements had not been, so pronounced earlier. So in this decision, someone who had achieved what Ambedkar had achieved could be nothing but a god. This was the attitude, because his achievements were so enormous for that community. There are not any more details. I should give credit to Anand Teltumde. It's Teltumde who told me about this episode, and I looked into it. There aren't many more details about it, but nevertheless, in the information we have is so significant, because that deification has certainly not died down. In fact, it is, in certain circles, it has only increased. And the very fact that I mentioned this episode will actually disturb those who continue the deification. This is to treat Ambedkar as a man, and to point out that he himself laughed hysterically at being considered anything but a man, will of course bother people, some people today, who carry on the deification.
So, was Dr. Ambedkar initially perhaps not that enthusiastic about direct action at the time of the Mahad Satyagraha? And how did it change him?
Yes, I think, again, to bring up Anand Teltumde's thesis is that it took so long for Dr. Ambedkar to set a date for the Mahad Satyagraha, precisely because of his ambivalence about overt direct action. I don't see a great deal of evidence for that thesis. On the contrary, watching what he was going through between 1924 and 27 suggests to me, as I try to chronicle in those chapters suggests to me that he was already juggling so many things. The catalyst, I don't believe, was a change of his mind about whether he wanted to pursue direct action or not. Rather, the catalyst was actually witnessing the success of direct action performed by his community itself. In other words, direct action had been the prerogative of the movement of helping the Harijans. When he saw Comrade More, effectively executing direct action with untouchable communities themselves, I believe this kind of awoke for him the idea that he needs to prioritize this over other things he was pursuing, which is, for example, social work, social welfare, grassroots social activism, lawyering, being an advocate, writing. He was still writing books and articles, and so on. So his change, I can't tell you the historical fact in this one, but there's less evidence for Teltumde's thesis that he was not interested in direct action and then changed his mind. There's more evidence that he was surprised by the effectiveness of direct action performed by his own community and then went into it with all of his might and passion.
His conversation actually is also very interesting, but unfortunately too brief.
Yes.
Because Attlee was there as part of the Simon Commission, and he was asking these questions from a vantage point of purely class-based analysis.
Yes.
So there's nothing more to it. More to that.
Unfortunately, it doesn't go farther. But as I mentioned, the exchanges that Dr. Ambedkar had in other public commissions show that he had very strong socialist, if not communist, bent in his economic thinking. So the debate with Attlee is fascinating because I think they agree on the theoretical points, but the practical issue is what stumps Dr. Ambedkar. And this, I even point out in the biography, Attlee asks Ambedkar a question he can't answer. And I don't think it's that he can't answer it because of any intellectual limitation on his part. I mean, Ambedkar had no intellectual limitations compared to the likes of us. It was just such a profoundly difficult question, and one that remains debated even today. So although the exchange is brief, I think it's extremely fundamental. It's a fundamental one, which might be why it's brief, because there may have been no answer possible at the time. There hasn't even been given a satisfactory answer till date.
I think we'd better wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your time. A very enlightening conversation.
Thank you very much. I hope people find it interesting. I hope the book makes some impact in correcting, the record, because there's so much new to discover in Babasaheb's life, and I'm struggling to get that out.
Here's the book again, and here's wishing you success and looking forward to the second part.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye.